Hello everyone, I'm Shaminda Pereira and I lead all learning initiatives at Volunteer MBC. We have a great topic today and a much needed one as we take back control of the unprecedented circumstances which all of us are facing today. Times are still uncertain as we see when we turn on the news. I believe the information, expertise and tips shared in our forum today will give us tools to focus on our COVID-19 recovery efforts. The topic is strategic foresight, and it goes a little bit beyond strategic planning and trends analysis. Adriane and Eric will dive a little bit deeper into that statement. Uh, Adriane, of course, is no stranger to Peel. She's involved in the volunteer engagement sector for more than 20 years, working in organizations both small and large. She is past president of a local AVA as well as past president of PAVRO. She's a volunteer engagement consultant and strongly believes in the importance of supporting each other to continue learning and growing. Pre-COVID, she was an active volunteer at Pearson Airport and is currently, like many of your volunteers, impatiently waiting to come back to volunteer. Our strategic foresight expert today is Eric Blais. Eric brings over 25 years of academic knowledge and practical experience, leading brands big and small, to build a sustainable practice through strategic foresight. Enamored with the new, the now, and the next, Eric believes that a strong vision sets the strategy, while design thinking makes the impossible happen. And that is where you got me all excited, Eric. He loves making the complex and the future plausible. Wrapped in humor and unconventional wisdom, he customizes each innovation process using proven methodology. Borrowing from the Buddhist philosophy, Eric says change is inevitable, suffering is optional. And that last statement, Eric, is a great segue to what you and Adriane is going to share with us. So without
Hey there. I don't hear Eric. Eric, are you going to kick us off? You know?
Hey, I was muted.
Oh, that's how all calls start these days.
Does that foretell what's about to happen? I don't know. So thank you, Shaminda, for that great intro. For those of you who could read lips, I'm about to say the exact same words that I did for the last 60 seconds. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity for both Adriane and I to speak today. And as any good relay race, what we're going to do is I'll kick off the presentation, and then I'll pass over the baton to Adriane at the halfway point. That being said, she will pepper the conversation as I present, and I will do the same during her slides as well. But I really invite, we are both, as you can see, very approachable and congenial. So feel free to open your mics and to ask questions or to make comments as we present. We'll gladly answer them or comment right back. Just before I start, because I gave a presentation 2 weeks ago, thinking that my presentation was showing, went through 3 slides, 20 minutes went through, nobody said anything, and then somebody said, we can't see your presentation. So I just want to make sure that everybody can see my presentation. Not at all. So
we see you.
For some people that's nice, for some people not so much. Please let me know when you see the presentation.
There we go.
You're good?
Yes, we can see you.
Excellent. All right. So this story starts in the month of November, 11 years ago, 2009. So at that time, I had just completed a certificate in design management, and I was working in the digital world. So I had been a design manager. That's where I led to. I started off as a web designer, a web developer, and then I managed a design team. But I believe in lifelong learning, and also I wanted to learn and get more challenges. So I was at a digital media conference called Next Media, which was downtown here at one of the big super clubs, which was called Circa, for those of you who remember. It didn't last very long, but it was incredibly impressive from an art and a design perspective. So the entire, it had no windows. So for 2 days, we were stuck in that nightclub with absolutely no windows. But it was there that I was introduced to OCAD University and their master's program. So they had a brand new master's program in strategic foresight and innovation. They were giving the presentation to everybody to garner up interest, but they were really looking for volunteers or for organizations that would take some of their students and bring them in and do some kind of innovation project. And when I watched the presentation, it really clicked. It was a natural progression to everything I had learned at Ryerson in that design management certificate. So I signed up. In 2010, September, I started this. So exactly 10 years ago, I started my master's study. What was interesting, though, is I understood the innovation part of it because I've always been in that role. So my entire career, as you can tell, because I was with the web, and I started coding when it was Mosaic was the only browser, and then after that, Net was their first one. So that was back in 95 and 1996. So I was familiar with innovation, but I didn't have any formal theories or any formal processes. I had design management ones, which had come in really, really handy for me. So I understood the word innovation, but strategic foresight meant absolutely nothing to me. Now, if you look at the word strategic foresight, foresight is the main word, and therefore foresight is looking forward. And then strategic is the art of planning, or strategy is the art of planning. So it's basically planning for the future, and that's what it is. So strategic foresight, we'll start off with a nice definition, is the ability to plan for the future by studying existing behavior and estimating, assessing, and projecting its impact moving forward. So behavior is the key word here, and something to remember throughout this conversation. It is a proven academic discipline which can help organizations make sense of the world and the future when things are unclear. Now, proven academic discipline is really nice if you're reading an article or if you're in school and you're you're reading a whole bunch of journals or books that were written about the future. What's interesting is when you get both feet steeped deep in the discipline and you start doing it, and then the future actually becomes the present, and you can see the impact that this exercise has and what it can do. So at first, when I learned it, it was all about the future. And I've always been about, I love science fiction. I love every new gadget that comes out. My whole life has always been about thinking forward. But what I realized in working in this, in both in the corporate world and then working with Adriane on this project together, was it's actually a sense-making exercise as well. It's for those moments where you really don't understand what in the world is happening right now. It allows you, it gives you tools so that all of a sudden things make sense and you can move forward. Now, if you want to push that esoterically, everybody's suffering from anxiety. Anxiety has been defined as fear for the future. Now, if we're doing this type of work, and if you all of a sudden you make sense of the present and of the future, then all of a sudden that anxiety level goes way down. Now we follow a very structured process. So it starts by defining the domain. So in this case, the domain that's important to all of you here today is volunteer engagement. And that's where Adriane was the subject matter expert. I was there to manage the process, the slide you have in front of you, to do the research and some of the legwork with her and have those conversations, because this is all based on conversation. It's very much a collaborative exercise. But I've also done it for finance as a domain when I was in school, and I've done 2 strategic foresight exercises for the media industry. For 4 years, I was responsible for managing an innovation lab for Numeris. For those of you who don't know who Numeris is, they measure audiences for television and radio. They basically create the currency for the media industry. What does that mean? For 1%, that means 1% of the audience equals $1 million. So they measure the size of the audience, and that gives the value of that advertising spot. So it was an organization that's roughly 100 years old, almost 100 years old. I was responsible for shifting or changing the research methodologies that they use to measure those audiences. That was really hard because they were established business model and established academic research methods. What was great though was the strategic foresight. When I started in 2014, I walked into that office. 2 weeks later, Netflix won their first Emmy for House of Cards. YouTube was gaining traction, and then the whole TV industry was up in arms wondering what is happening, what will the impact of streaming have on our business? Meanwhile, radio, it was champagne and caviar, and they were just moving forward, and nothing was, there were no impact to it. So by using strategic foresight, what we could do is we could start looking at what the future might look like so that we could plan accordingly and then help the industry, the media industry, most specifically the television industry and the advertising industry, weather the storm brought about by the digital transformation that was happening all over the world. So you start off by defining the domain, then you lock the question, and I will show you the question that we had for this trend deck that we created, Adriane and I together, with the help of Rhonda, which was our editor. She's an amazing editor. She looks at what your basic argument is, and she goes above and beyond the language itself, but what you're actually trying to say. And she's very witty to boot. Then you look at trends, and here this is where trends is really, really important. We're not talking about something that's specifically new, like a fashion trend, although that might be included. The trend is defined specifically as observable behavior repeated over time. If it's not repeated over time, it's a fad or a blip. It just happened and then it went away. Do you all remember pet rocks or pound rocks? So that would be an example of a fad. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, in the 80s, for young kids and young teenagers, they basically had rocks with squiggly eyes on them and some hair, and that was their pet, and they would bring it with them. And so they didn't really need a dog or a cat, they could just have a rock. So you look at, so that was a trend at that time. Now, the thing to remember is that for the most part, you can't really foretell the future. So there's one thing that we all know, we're all ending up at the same place. But between now and that final transition, if you want to call it, we don't know the detailing of what's about to happen. So there are many possibilities that might have happened. So that's why we say that the future is plural. Not singular, but plural. Oh, I see, I had Mexican jumping beans. I love it. So my friends had that and I was really, really jealous. So that was another blast from the 80s. So when we're looking at it, we know that we are now. We know at what the future might look like. I have another example of that. I have a good friend of mine who's exactly 10 years younger than me. She's 41 years old. She had decided that she wanted to pay off both mortgages and basically half retire at the age of 41. What she did was she bought a condo, and then she bought a cottage, and then she bought another condo in Jamaica. And before you think that she's some kind of a wealthy person, she's really not. She works in an administrative role at the University of Toronto, but she played the market. And she had a long-term 10-year plan. So she was planning towards the future. And that's what she did. She bought within her means. It's a very small cottage. It's a 1-bedroom condo in Jamaica. But she had her 2-bedroom condo here, which she sold. And that basically paid for the other 2. So she had this vision of where she wanted to be in the future. And she started to plan for it and work that plan. And what we call that is your preferred future. And that's what we're all working through. When you're doing strategy is you're always maneuvering yourself till you get to that preferred future. Now, between where you are now and that preferred future, there's things that you don't know. And that's what we call critical uncertainties. That's number 4 in the process. So you sit down together and you go, okay, what is it that we don't know? And then when we look at everything that we don't know, we can start going, okay, well, if this happens, then this is what the future looks like. And that definition, this is what the future looks like, is a scenario. So a scenario could be short term. So an example of that is, if I don't clean my condo and my mom comes to visit, I'm going to get a good talking to, even though I'm a middle-aged man. That's a short-term scenario. I can already predict the future. If I continue shopping, impulse shopping on Instagram and Facebook like I've been doing, my credit card bill will come in and I'll probably max out my credit card. That is a very plausible future. That's a very short time. But it's all tongue in cheek, but it's to make you think that you can sort of know the future and then you can align yourself. So by aligning myself, I'm creating a strategy. So my strategy is I don't want my credit card to be maxed out. So therefore I will stop spending, or I will take Facebook or Instagram off of my cell phone and basically mitigate that behavior. So it always begins with behavior and then ends up with a strategy. So in this case, when the pandemic hit, and Adriane, I'll let you pepper that with more comments, but she said it was okay with me to share. She was at Heart and Stroke, as many of you know. She was responsible for volunteer management. And I'd just like to let you know that I did 5 years while I was doing my undergrad degree, working for the federal government, doing administrative work. But my first job out of university, I was actually managing volunteers for a housing co-op. So that's how I started and then moved towards digital. So she was responsible for managing volunteers at Heart and Stroke. And then my big gig right now is I'm helping a startup from Quebec City, which is revolutionizing how radio conducts business. And I can give you more details about that one-on-one, or you can email me or reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want more details. So as a result of the pandemic, all of a sudden, poor Adriane was furloughed and my hours were dramatically decreased. And I'm a consultant, which means that all of a sudden, all the money I was putting aside for vacation was all gone. And then Adriane, all of a sudden, for the first time in her career, found herself with lots of time on her hands.
and no paycheck.
No paycheck. And complete uncertainty of what the future looked like. On top of that, on the news, it was all about the pandemic. And remember that this pandemic is really new. When you think about the history of mankind, it basically hit end of 2019 in Asia, although arguably there's a lot of evidence that it said it had spread to Europe at that time as well. But we didn't really know anything about it if you think about it. So there were ideas, science had some indication about it, but nobody had any idea how to deal with this highly transmittable disease that was wreaking havoc, especially in the hospital domain.
Mm-hmm.
So Adriane and I started talking, and I love strategic foresight. I had done 2 strategic foresight exercises in media. I told you about this. The first one was for 5 years. It was the Netflix example. Now, this was presented to the board of directors, and on that board of directors was every single president of all the big media groups. So we're talking Rogers, Bell, Chorus, Cogeco, and then heads of marketing for large blue chip brands. So we're talking people like Procter & Gamble and agencies, large agencies like Group M. They all saw this. They saw all the trend deck that we had pulled. So behavior repeated over time. So we will show you example of what trends look like moving forward. So they had the trend deck that was specifically created, researched, and designed for the media industry. And we had created 5-year scenarios, and we had used a very specific technique called a 4x4 matrix. So because the future is plural, like I mentioned, we created 4 strong scenarios. And those 4 scenarios, we thought, okay, the future will either be one of these scenarios or a combination of all 4, or there'll be different degrees or elements of those scenarios all pulled together. This was so popular, and everybody sighed a breath of relief. I got a standing ovation from the board of directors for it, which was a big surprise because up until then, nobody knew why I was hired. It was all nebulous, strategic foresight and innovation. And then they brought that back into their organizations, and then started building products or strategizing or redesigning strategy to be able to meet the future. And an example of that is Crave. I don't know if any of you subscribe to it or use it online, but you can see a practical application of those scenarios. And then the next one, I was asked to do one for 10 years. So now we had a better understanding of what the future looked like and where people were moving towards and how their behavior was changing. And then what we did was we did 10 years from now. So this was in 2017, and we were looking at the future in 2027. And we can start seeing now that behavior is indicative of the scenarios that we had created at that time. Now, this wasn't done by myself. I did the grunt work, some of the research, the writing, but all of the assessments, all of the strategies were done in huge groups of people. And then for the Strategic Foresight, it was actually presented to over 100 people. And I got feedback from all of that and incorporated that in the scenarios and helped them either design new strategies or vet them. So our domain is volunteer engagement. Our main question going in was, what does volunteer engagement in hospitals look like post-pandemic? There's a caveat to that. So at first it was, what does volunteer engagement looks like post-pandemic? But then Adriane was lucky enough to get a new gig right away at a hospital. So then we better detailed or more defined what the question was, and then relegated it to hospitals. But that doesn't mean you can't go. Anybody that's in volunteer engagement can look at the deck. They'll see that sometimes it's more, the trends are more geared towards hospital, but they can all get great information, I hope, or inspirational information out of it.
And just to comment on that, we had started the work while I was still furloughed. So I was not working at the hospital. And so when I did get that job and we sort of pivoted to the focus on hospitals, a lot of the information that we had already identified still held true. So though, you know, some of the information here is focused on hospitals, it really is applicable to many, many sectors and organizations.
The interesting thing too is that so right now I'm actually helping another group, which is theater, which is really, really hard hit, especially live theater. So we're doing a similar exercise. And the first question that I had is, everybody always equates trend to new. But if you remember that trend is observable behavior repeated over time, sometimes a trend is new, absolutely. But sometimes it's an established trend that's still happening. And it's important to remember that, because that has an implication on your day-to-day operations. So the first step, as I said, so we've got our domain, we've got our question, we started looking at trends. So observable behavior repeated over time. So when we look at this chart, the chart is laid out like the trend deck that we created. But if you think about it from a process perspective, I'd like you to look at the very last icon at the end, signals, and you've got the person with the la loupe in French, the magnifying glass, yeah. And then it's what you can actually see. So what can I see, feel, hear, or smell that indicates trend is happening? So we start off with that. Then what we do is then you need to start analyzing this behavior. So is this behavior happening a lot or little? And why are people behaving that way? So I'm asking all of you who have taken, back for me, it was grade 13 physics, but it may be grade 12 for some of you, or university physics, but there's always a driving force. There's always a stick or a carrot that's driving that behavior. So what are those drivers? Now, we know this behavior is happening. We have an indication of what's pushing that behavior. What impact does it have to for my organization? So what does the impact of purchasing a whole bunch of cups and clothes off of Facebook have on my finances in the end? So the impact is right now. What is the impact of that trend on my organization? So up until now, this is all based on empirical evidence. So it's all academic, it's all research-based. In the trend deck, the signals that we have, the observable behavior, it's all from literary review, because that's readily accessible. But that's not your only source. You could actually conduct interviews. That's what I did with Adriane as my subject matter expert. So got information from her. We actually had conversations with people on Facebook and got information from there. That peppered some of the trends as well. So then we get into implications, and that's where the conjecture or the art or the creativity comes to play. So then you start to have to think, remember we were talking about all the plausible futures, the future is plural? That's the implication. So you start with one straight line, and then you've got diverting lines, and you're like, okay, if this behavior continues 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5, 10, I've got friends that are doing strategic foresight for 50 years from now. What does the future look like at that point? So that you have to look at it from a positive and a negative. You have to keep your feet firmly grounded in the present, but your head far in the future. So that's where you're at. These are the implications. The way that I learned is you had extrapolations. So you had implications, which was the implications of the trend on your business, which was more short term, and then extrapolation towards the future. I've combined them together. I find it's more concise. There's already enough. We're already bombarded with a lot of information. I find this makes it a nice, digestible way of starting to look at plausible futures. Now back to the laws of physics. For each trend, there is a counter trend. So for each action, there is a counter action. So what is the opposite observable behavior that's in the marketplace? And the thing is, counter trends are really tricky. It's really easy to say there's none, and that's really false. It doesn't follow the laws of physics. What's true is that it might not be observable yet, or you might not have found it yet, but there is a counter trend out there, and it's important to remember that it's there. Here's a really good example that everybody can relate to it right now. So we are asked to wear masks right now, especially indoors, but outdoors if there's large gatherings. I don't know if you've seen, but in both Montreal a few months ago, last weekend near Winnipeg, and here in Toronto quite regularly, there are anti-masks rallies that are happening where people are coming through. So the trend is the majority of us, or I hope the majority of us, are wearing masks, but the counter trend is that there's a whole group or segment of people that are opposing. I could have used the US elections as an example as well, but I think you're all tired of hearing about it, so I will skip that example. So that brings us to the trend analysis. So here, let's bring us back to the topic of the day. We start off with observable behavior. So I think this is something that everybody's really familiar with right now. We also have one in the house because I'm a gadget freak. But we start off, if you've gone to Apple or if you've gone to a variety of different places, they take your temperature when you come in. That's a new trend. It's new observable behavior that's repeated over time. So we start off with that observation. This time it's a first person observation, something you saw in the field. Then Adriane and I went online and we started to do a literature review of what was happening in terms of screening. So we were looking, so we see a thermometer, we see a person, there's looking at their temperature, they're actually screening for their health. So we started looking at different resources in a wide variety of industries and domain, pulled that together, and that was the basis of our first trend. And then Adriane, may I pass this along to you?
I like that you pose that as a question. What if I say no?
I can continue.
I wouldn't, but we'd watch Eric tap dance. So one of the really interesting things I found with this process was just the different perspectives that Eric and I came to things with. And we found often there was a miscommunication when he would talk about, he would use a term and I would interpret that with the volunteer engagement or not-for-profit sector lens, and he's coming to it from a different perspective. So this is a classic example when we were talking about and working through this process and we talked about volunteer screening. I think for most of us, our thoughts go to, Volunteer Canada's 10 steps. Oh, can I turn on my video? Well, if that's what you want. So when you're looking at Volunteer Canada's 10 steps, that's one thing, but this is not the focus. So our focus with volunteer screening was talking about that health screening and how are we doing that. Sorry, I've got tons of messages popping up since I put on my my camera. Whew, who knew? Anyway, so what I found was really interesting when we go through this. So looking at health screening, and for me, I found this more as an opportunity to make some, those scenarios and play out the different scenarios and what the impact is. So for example, as we were looking at volunteer screening, so will health screening become the new normal for our organizations and even those not interacting with clients? Will it be the same type of screening? Will it be different depending on the role? So I think that though this is right now, it's external. Hi, Eric, I can see you now. While this is external to Volunteer Canada's 10 steps of screening, when we look at the future, I think that this is going to be an important trend that will be part of our 10 steps of screening as part of the risk assessment. So making sure that we are assessing the risk for health, even though, yeah, we're hearing that there are vaccines coming along the road, which is great. But we're still going to be quite some time before everyone has received it. We know, as we're looking at the future and we're seeing our anti-maskers, we have anti-vaxxers already. So if you have volunteers or clients who are anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, are you still going to allow them to be engaged within your organization? What are your policies? For me, I found this really just led to a bunch of questions. So, all right, so we've decided as an organization, we're doing health screening for every person who comes through. Are we doing that? Are we doing temperature checks? Are we doing just, going through the COVID screening checklist? Are we giving people a mask, or are we letting them bring their own masks in? Are we making everyone wear a face shield as well as a mask? Or are they wearing their own thing or not bringing, wearing the extra PPE, so personal protective equipment? Sorry, my daughter is just behind me making lunch. Sorry for the distraction. But that's how Zoom calls go these days, right? You get to see people's lives and their kids making lunch. So I found this was a really interesting exercise, and it talked, as we talked about what those potential impacts are. So what are our liability concerns and who is addressing those? So if you are doing this sort of an exercise within your organization, it's helpful to also bring in stakeholders from various teams. So, when you're considering what those liability concerns may be, you may want to have a board member as part of this exercise, brainstorming and considering what the impacts are and how are we going to mitigate those impacts. You may have someone from your finance team, or if you have a legal team, your legal team may be part of this. You may want to have clients or other volunteers be involved as well. We look at the potential risk to your organization's reputation. So you decide within your organization, if there's no risk, we're socially distanced, it's fine, everybody can come in. We're outdoors and we're doing a tree planting, so people are far enough apart, it's fine. We don't need to do any screening. And then someone coughs on someone else and they transmit COVID, or they transmit, even when COVID is gone. I think there are a lot of things that we are implementing now that will still carry over. And so even if it's not COVID, how are we mitigating these risks? What is health screening going to look like? Who's going to pay for it? There's a lot that you can start to dig into and really start to build those potential futures. So could we go to the next slide, please?
Absolutely.
Oh, thanks. My daughter's making lunch and she's not bringing anything for me, but it would be rude to eat while we're all staring at me. So you can see from here, Eric and I, we identified a couple of different futures. So looking at next year, looking at a couple years down the road and a little bit further. And so by identifying what these potential futures could be, it helps us plan for how are we going to address those, and then building those scenarios and working it through. So let's just take another, go forward to the next trend that we identified.
Sure. While I do that, I just want to touch again on your opening statement when we were talking about jargon and about volunteer engagement. I love that you brought up that checklist, the standard checklist that everybody uses for volunteer engagement. And then we had this great discussion that maybe it needs to be revised now in this new world, and maybe it's no longer a 10-step checklist, and we have to bring in some health volunteer screening points within it as well.
Absolutely. And I think you could call in the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement as well and look at, because that identifies best practices for our volunteer programs, I think that we probably need to look at some changes to that one as well. All right, so this is my sort of my soapbox, and it was really funny because this one was so hard to find examples of it being in existence. There were not a lot of articles talking about volunteer engagement, professionals, leaders, managers of volunteers. There's not a lot of information out there about the fact that often we're missing from those tables where decisions are made. And I think, excuse me, I think that we need to be at those tables, or we need to be influencing the conversations that are held at those tables. I have recently been involved with Pavro again, sort of focused on advocacy, and this really dovetails with that. I think that in organizations, you are generally the expert on best practices in volunteer engagement. And by going through this sort of an exercise, you're able to take scenarios and take them to your senior leadership teams, or whether it needs to go to your manager or director and up to senior leadership. If you're able to present to senior leadership, I think it's really important, because I think there's going to be a lot of impact. And I think that if we are not at those tables, it's going to be a huge disservice to our organizations, to our volunteers, and to the people that we serve. I think that one of the things that Eric was talking about was sort of that sometimes if we don't know the future, we're afraid of the future. And one of the things he and I had talked about, and he commented to me that when we were doing this exercise, it gave him peace, and it gave him a sense of like, oh, okay, so I'm sort of in charge of the future, or the future I have some influence over, and this is your role. So this is your opportunity. Yeah, change can be scary, change can be uncomfortable, but it can also be really exciting, and it's an opportunity to innovate and to try things that we haven't done before. So I think it's important that we are at the tables, that we can get to the tables, and hopefully as our economy starts to pick back up and as we're moving through the pandemic, I do hope that organizations who laid off or furloughed their volunteer engagement leaders, I really, really hope that that those roles are coming back. And I would encourage each of you to be really bold and to be strong and fearless leaders, because that's what you are, and that's what you're going to bring to your organizations. So just like things like using this and the previous trend about screening, so bringing that to your senior leadership team. Have they thought about this? Have they considered this? Have they looked at the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement? Most likely, most of them have never heard of it, let alone used it. And that's okay. That's your area of expertise. So you are the one that can lead and open the door for those conversations. Can we go to the next slide, Eric? So one of the things that, as we're looking at some of those implications, we were looking at what happens if we don't have our volunteer leaders in place, and it gives us some opportunity to really identify the future that we want and influence that. Excuse me, dry throat. It's not COVID, I promise. And so as we went through this, it did help. And I think we'll just go to the last trend that we were going to talk about today, which was recovering funding. And it was really interesting because when we started this, I was still working for Heart and Stroke. And for those of you who know or don't know Heart and Stroke, there's a lot of focus on fundraising. And so I wanted to, as I was laid off, I wanted to be able to develop a tool or a resource so that when I come back, I was able to demonstrate some suggestions and some strategies that we could leverage in order to find new sources of revenue or fundraising or whatever needed to be done. I wanted to be able to come back to the organization with that, that resource in hand. And for many of us, funding is so precarious. Yeah, I work at a hospital now, but even in a hospital, we're looking at huge deficits. We're looking at how we're going to restructure, how we're going to organize things. But we know in our organizations, money's tight. Funding opportunities are really, really competitive. And so how's that going to impact our organizations? Does that mean funding that we used to have is gone? So now we're not able to run the programs that we previously would run and offer to our clients. If we're no longer offering those programs, what is the impact? I think we've all seen pretty much any fundraising initiative that we had that would have been in person. They've all pivoted to an online model. And there's a lot of presumptions. Some of the other trends that Eric and I identified really focus on the impact of technology and the presumption that everyone is savvy and everyone has access to high-speed internet, which is not the reality for a lot of people. So when we're looking at these impacts, again, this is where you can really add value, is to get together even with your fund development team and start to brainstorm. All right, well, what are some opportunities that we have? And poke holes, ask questions, and flex your muscles a little. Can we go to the next slide there, Eric? Oh, we didn't do the other part. All right, so that's okay. Oh, there it is. So when Eric and I were working through this and we looked at 2021, so we identified that one of the challenges or an implication extrapolation could be that there's a significant reduction in research and diminishment of direct services. So grants that used to come to us for this are gone. So now as an organization, we have to pivot or we're not able to do that. How will that impact us in the future moving forward? It's really interesting to go through. And as I say, I like these scenarios because it really just gives you the opportunity to ask questions. And the nice thing is you can ask questions and you don't need the answers. The point of this is not to have the answers at this point, but to design the future that you want so that, when you look at your counter trends or some of these trends that are, could be quite damaging to our organizations or our clients or the people we serve, it gives you the opportunity to build scenarios, test them out, and move to a more successful, fingers crossed, model. So I think I'm going to stop there, and then Eric, do you want to take it away with the next slide? Okay.
So I'd just like to move. Oh, can I get Adriane? Can I get you to mute your mic just first? Okay, thank you. So I just want to, the example that Adriane had given, the implications and extrapolations, there is a significant reduction in research and diminishment of direct services. So that really is an implication of the funding for the organization. If you look at that, then the critical uncertainty then becomes, well, what factors will lead to agencies folding or surviving? For those that fold, is their process or topic documentation extant, and will it be shared to allow another agency not to be forced to start from scratch? So if you push that in a scenario, then all of a sudden you could have a preferred future state where you have all that documentation is ready, and basically you can cocoon, or like a bear, you can just weather it out through the inclement weather until things pick up again, and then you can pick up where you had left off. So see where that critical uncertainty can become a whole bunch of possible solutions. Each of those solutions is a future in itself. So with me, if you were doing this, you would look at it, you would look at all the trends that resonate with you, and then you would pull those trends, look at the critical uncertainties, establish what your timeline is, whether it's 6 months or 10 years or more, and then start aggregating them together based on your initial question. So just like if you went to see a fortune teller and you sat down and they had either a set of tarot cards or they had a crystal ball like the mini one I have here, you would start off with, okay, I want to know this about the future. Look at the trends, start looking at what the possible scenarios, and then act accordingly. So as next steps in this, so this was both Adriane and I's labor of love. So there's 33 trends that we've come up with. They use the STEEP V model, and it's an acronym. It stands for social, technology, economics, ecology, political, and then V for values. We pull behavior or trends in each of those buckets, like social or technology, and you do that to make sure that you're not blindsided by behavior that's happening in the marketplace that just could come and completely kill your strategy or really impact it. One idea of that as another tongue-in-cheek example was when the pandemic hit, my partner and I, we were on our way to New York. So our preferred future was to be in Manhattan and to go see a show. And then all of a sudden we were sideswipe. And if you're curious, in strategic foresight parlance, that's called a black swan. So something happened and it completely changed all of our future, all of our plans at that time. So starting with the trends that we've come up with, there's 32 trends in all. It's quite an extensive deck. There's a lot of information in it. So if ever you were interested, we can sit down with you or your organization, Adriane and I, and review all 33 trends. Or we could start with those trends and start establishing scenarios. So you could pull those trends from the 33, and we could start talking about what your preferred future state is, define those scenarios, and then move accordingly. Now, all this is mute if you don't have a plan. The whole part of this in the strategic foresight is to establish a plan. So you need that strategy. So another step would be the future for some people might be really, really unsure right now, especially if you're in a funding crisis or in a labor crisis. So what we can do is we can do very, very easy scenarios, very short-term, month or a few months, one line, non-extensive, and then either create or design a strategy or vet a plan, an existing plan based on those scenarios. And last but not least, I love doing this work, happy to work in any domain. As you can see, the process is the same. It doesn't matter where you're from. So happy to help you along this endeavor. I can help you out every step of the way, provide you with more information. I could do a whole new trend deck with you based on a particular question you have about the future, but happy to help. Or if ever you're curious about OCAD-U and you would like to continue your education, I can answer your questions about that too. So I see we're at 12:55. I didn't leave enough or a lot of room for questions, hoping that you would interrupt us, but we can definitely answer some now. What is a formula or thinking process to establish a proper counter trend? So I do a simple opposite game. So A very easy example is if I'm spending too much, the counter trend is to not spend a lot. So right now, if you want to, so I started really tongue-in-cheek, but see how this can become quite serious. So I'm not alone. So people getting into debt right now because of the pandemic and shopping online is a real trend that's happening. A counter trend that's happening is people that are incredibly fearful have absolutely stopped spending. So all of a sudden, they're not, the economy is declining, especially in certain verticals, because there's just no money circulating in that sense. So that's my basic approach. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, though. It requires you to think more meta level. So by that, I mean, instead of looking at the specific tree or the behavior, look at the driving forces or at the forest as a whole and see what the opposite behavior is in that context.
And actually, I had a really interesting example just even at the hospital. We had a group of volunteers chomping at the bit to come back. They wanted to come back. They wanted to be doing what they were doing. And then that counter trend was the volunteers who looked at the number of cases of COVID in the community and said, there's no way I'm going back. So it can be a very simple and straightforward trend and counter trend as the opposites.
So I see the question is there a trend and counter trend? Is there something like a net value that is supposed to be considered? So could you provide more detail? So I'd like to know if your net value is qualitative or quantitative in...
Hi, that's Sean. I
Yep.
meant even qualitative, like in your mask example, right? You mentioned that there's the anti-maskers and maybe more people are wearing masks overall. So, do you then kind of diminish the how much you're going to consider the anti-maskers because it's a small, it's not necessarily enough to completely overwhelm the trend?
Yeah, it's a dangerous game to play because it's a David and Goliath scenario. So it might not appear of equal value right now because it's much smaller, but it could have dramatic impact moving forward. So the idea in that case is just to keep it in the back of your mind as you're building your scenarios so that you can move forward. The net in that case, for the anti-maskers, it's a really great question because what is the driving force of the anti-maskers? It's personal freedoms. And we were all raised thinking that we were living in a really highly free society. And for a lot of people, they don't consider the impact of their actions on a day-to-day basis. So right now, their fundamental values are being attacked. So it's not about wearing the mask, it's about being forced to wear the mask. And then all of a sudden you can start seeing how that trend is different and start from a design perspective, empathizing with people that have a differing point of view. I'm at time. Do you want me to continue answering questions or what would you like to do?
I think we can take one more question, Eric, maybe.
Okay. So the next one was in the future trending. Did you factor in scenarios that includes the impact of a future pandemic? So we're not at the scenario stage. So we are at a formal, I should say, strategic foresight scenario stage. So what we're at right now is we've done the impact and the implications to the hospital should that behavior continue. The idea then would be to look at those 33 decks, pull out the ones that are important, and then really define what the question is. And in that, so I like your the question, the impact of a future pandemic, because if you think of waves, people say that we're in the second wave, and in the US they're having third waves. These are future pandemics. So we had the first impact, then we had a relatively, and please don't, I'm really saying relatively pandemic-free summer. We know that it wasn't, but you know that it was more relaxed and things started to happen. And now the proverbial poop is hitting the fan, and we're really into uncharted territory once again. But now we have more empirical evidence because we all know health as a whole, on relationships. Now, before coming up with a solution, we need to take the empirical evidence we have creating those scenarios. So that's why in this case it becomes really difficult to do 5 years, 10 years scenarios.
Thank you, Eric. That was wonderful. We could go on, and I'm sure everybody would love to see for another hour. It was just so wonderful. Thank you so much. And there are some more questions coming in. Please, everyone, continue to pose your questions. We will reach out to Adriane and Eric and get you the answers. And the recording will be available and on our website, so you can access the recording to rehash and review the webinar. Thank you, Adriane and Eric. This was absolutely wonderful. And I know we're going past time. We just have a few closing comments. There are more resources available. You'll definitely have access to the webcast, the registration link to our next COVID-19 forum. And on the screen, you will see there are upcoming forums, virtual forums, and the one that on the 24th is on virtual volunteering. And on December the 3rd, as Sean had mentioned, we're going to be talking about bringing the community together through volunteerism, and we hope that you will be able to join us all at that point. Thanks again. Really, really appreciate all your time. And this has been absolutely wonderful and very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Everyone, take good care. Stay safe. And we'll see you again at the next forum. Thank you.